The screaming started at midnight, and it did not stop. Two tiny voices, twin pups barely 8 months old, wailed through the stone halls of Blackthorn Castle with a force that rattled the windows in their frames. Servants pressed their hands over their ears. Guards abandoned their posts rather than stand near the nursery door, and in the throne room below, Alpha King Draven Ashguard sat with his head in his hands, listening to his own children cry themselves raw for the 4th night in a row. He was the strongest alpha the Northern Territories had seen in 3 generations. He had crushed rival packs beneath his boot, silenced rebellions with a single growl, and made grown warriors drop to their knees just by shifting the weight of his gaze. But he could not make his own pups stop crying. And that, more than any battlefield, was the place where Draven Ashguard felt truly powerless. "Send for another nurse," he said, his voice low and cracked from exhaustion. His beta, Corwin, shifted uncomfortably by the door. "My king, we've sent for 6. The last one left with scratches down her arms. She said she said they screamed like something was wrong with them, like they could sense." "Sense what?" Draven's head snapped up, gold eyes flashing with warning. Corwin hesitated. "Their mother, my king. That she's gone." The words hit Draven like a blade between the ribs. His mate, Lyra, had died bringing those twins into the world 6 months ago, her body too fragile to survive a double birth, her wolf too weak to hold on. He had held her as she took her last breath, had felt the bond between them snap like a rope pulled too tight, and he had not cried. Alphas did not cry. But some nights, alone in his chambers, he wondered if that silence had cost him more than he understood. And now his children were paying for it, screaming through the nights as if grief had chosen them as its vessel, since their father refused to carry it himself. "Bring me someone who can fix this," Draven growled, rising from his throne with the kind of restrained violence that made the stone beneath his boots seem to tremble. "I don't care who. I don't care what rank. If they cannot silence my children, I will find someone who can." No one in that castle believed anyone could. No one, that is, except a girl mopping floors 3 levels below who had not yet been given the chance to try. Her name was Wren, and she had been an Omega her entire life, the lowest rank in wolf society, beneath warriors, beneath healers, beneath nearly everyone who mattered. She had been passed over at every rejection ceremony she'd ever attended, watched alphas and betas alike wrinkle their noses at her scent, as though it offended them simply by existing. 5 years ago, at just 19, she had felt the mate bond snap into place for the first time in her life. A burning thread pulling taut between her chest and a stranger across a crowded courtyard. She had looked up, heart hammering, hope blooming for the first time in a life that had given her so little of it. And she had looked directly into the gold eyes of Draven Ashguard. He had felt it too. She'd seen it in the way his jaw tightened, the way his nostrils flared, the way, for one suspended heartbeat, the future had cracked open in front of both of them, like a door swinging wide. And then he had turned to his advisors, to the crowd of watching wolves, and said the words that still lived like a splinter lodged deep in her chest. "An Omega, I refuse this mate bond." The words that could break a wolf. The words that had left her gasping on her knees in front of half the kingdom while he walked away without looking back. His rejection burning through the bond like acid, severing something inside her that had never quite healed. She had been reassigned that same week, sent far from his territory, buried in servant work in a distant outpost, where no one would remember the Omega girl the Alpha King had rejected, in front of his entire court. She never expected to see him again. She never expected to end up scrubbing the floors of his own castle 5 years later, brought in with a wave of new staff hired after half his previous servants fled from the screaming in the nursery. She kept her head down. She wore her hood up. She prayed every single day that he would never notice her, because the bond, broken as it was, had never fully died. She could still feel the faintest thread of it if she concentrated, like an old scar that ached before rain. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself she had built a life around not needing him, and most days She almost believed it. Then came the night the head of household burst into the servants' quarters, panic written across her face, demanding any woman with steady hands report to the nursery immediately, because the king had lost his patience, and the nurses had lost their nerve, and someone needed to make those pups stop crying, before the entire castle collapsed under the weight of their grief. Wren didn't raise her hand. She never raised her hand for anything. But when the head of household's eyes swept across the room and landed on her, unclaimed, unassigned, doing nothing more urgent than folding linens, she found herself being pulled forward by the wrist before she could protest. "You, Omega, go." "I've never cared for pups," Wren said quickly, panic rising in her throat. "I don't know anything about—" "I don't care what you know," the woman snapped. "I care that you're the only one in this room not currently needed elsewhere. Go, now, before the king decides to come down here himself and drag someone up by the collar." That was enough to make Wren's feet move. The nursery, when she reached it, was a war zone of grief. 2 cots sat side by side beneath a mural of a moon that some hopeful painter had added before the twins were born, back when someone still believed this room would be filled with peace instead of sorrow. The pups themselves, 1 boy and 1 girl, both with their father's black hair and startling gold eyes, were red-faced and thrashing. Their tiny fists curled, their cries so raw they'd gone hoarse, and yet somehow louder for it. 3 other servants stood at the edges of the room, hands pressed to their ears, clearly at the end of whatever rope they'd been clinging to. "Thank the goddess," one of them breathed when she saw Wren. "Please, just try something. Anything." Wren stood frozen in the doorway for a long moment, her heart pounding. The scent of grief and fear so thick in the room it nearly staggered her. She had never held a pup in her life. She had no mother's instinct to draw on, no training, nothing but the aching, hollow understanding of what it felt like to cry, until there was nothing left, and no one came. She approached the cots slowly, the way she might approach a wounded animal, and knelt down between them. "Hey," she whispered, so soft it was barely a sound at all. "Hey, little ones. I know it hurts." The boy pup, Kai, she would later learn his name was, turned his tear-streaked face toward her voice, his cries hitching for just a moment before rising again, but with less force this time. She reached out slowly and laid her palm flat against his tiny chest, feeling his heartbeat racing beneath her fingers, frantic as a bird trying to escape a cage. "You're safe," she murmured, and something in her own broken heart recognized the words as much as the pup did. "You're safe. I promise. I know it feels like the whole world ended. I know that feeling. But you're still here. And I'm right here too." She didn't know where the words came from. She didn't know why her Omega instincts, so long dismissed as worthless by everyone including herself, seemed to know exactly what these grieving pups needed. But as she spoke, low and steady, her hand moving in slow circles over Kai's chest, his cries began to soften. Not stop. Not immediately. But soften, the way a storm loses its fury when it runs out of rain. The girl pup, Vera, was harder. She screamed with a fury that seemed almost personal, as if she were furious at the universe itself for taking her mother before she'd even had the chance to know her. Wren moved her free hand to rest against the girl's small back, humming now, a wordless tune that rose from somewhere deep and instinctive, something that felt less like a learned lullaby and more like a memory from a life she'd never lived. "I've got you," she whispered. "Both of you. I've got you." Minutes passed. The servants at the edges of the room stood in stunned silence, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever fragile magic was happening in front of them. And slowly, impossibly, the screaming began to fade into whimpers, and the whimpers began to fade into hiccups, and the hiccups began to fade into the soft, shuddering breaths of 2 exhausted pups, finally succumbing to sleep. By the time both twins lay still in their cots, their small chests rising and falling in peaceful rhythm for the first time in 4 days, Wren's own face was wet with tears she hadn't realized she'd been crying. "How did you—" one of the servants started, but she was cut off by the sound of heavy footsteps in the corridor outside. footsteps that made every servant in the room stiffen at once. The door opened, and Alpha King Draven Ashguard stepped inside. He filled the doorway the way he filled every room he entered, broad-shouldered and radiating the kind of authority that made lesser wolves want to bare their throats on instinct. His golden eyes were rimmed with exhaustion, his jaw shadowed with days of sleeplessness, but the moment his gaze landed on the silent cots, something in his entire posture shifted. "They're asleep," he said, disbelief thick in his voice. "Yes, my king," one of the servants said quickly, gesturing toward Ren, who was still kneeling. And in the throne room, Alpha King Draven Blackthorn sat with his fists pressed against his temples, his elbows digging into the arms of a chair too large for the weight he carried tonight. He had faced down rogue packs in the dead of winter. He had torn out the throat of a rival alpha with his bare teeth. He had buried a mate he loved more than his own heartbeat, and he had done it without shedding a single tear in front of his people, because a king does not break where his people can see him. But this endless shrieking from two small bodies who shared her eyes, her exact shade of amber, was going to be the thing that finally brought him to his knees. "Someone make it stop," he said, and his voice did not sound like a king's voice. It sounded hollow, scraped out, the voice of a man drowning in a lake he could not swim out of. Beside him, his beta, Thorn, shifted his weight from foot to foot, refusing to meet his alpha's eyes. Thorn had seen Draven rip apart 3 grown men in a single night without flinching. He had never once seen him look like this, hunched and gray-faced, the powerful shoulders that carried the weight of an entire kingdom now curling inward like a man trying to disappear. "We have tried everything, Alpha," Thorn said carefully. "The healers gave them the calming herbs. The wet nurse tried feeding them again. Nothing works. They just cry harder. Then get more people. Get every Omega, every healer, every damn person in this castle who has ever held a child, and put them in that room until one of them figures out how to shut them up." Draven's claws had already begun to lengthen, dark and curved, pressing crescents into his own palms. Around him, the wolf inside him clawed at the surface, desperate to answer a call it could not translate into words. His pups were in pain. That was the only truth his instincts understood, and no throne, no crown, no army could soothe the father's wolf when his young were suffering, and he did not know why. It had been like this for 6 nights running. Not constant, not always at this volume, but building, worsening, as though something inside the twins was slowly cracking open, and nobody could find the fracture to seal it. During the day they seemed almost normal, if quieter than pups their age should be, watching the world with those uncanny amber eyes that missed nothing. But the moment darkness fell over Blackthorn Castle, the screaming began, and it summoned something ancient and terrified in every wolf who heard it. A sound that scraped against the deepest parts of the brain reserved for danger, for grief, for warnings that could not be ignored. The castle physician, an aging wolf named Alden who had delivered half the pups born into the pack in the last 30 years, had examined the twins 3 times already and found nothing wrong. No fever, no injury, no obvious cause for the distress that racked their small bodies until their faces went red and their tiny fists beat against anything within reach. It might be grief, Alden had told Draven privately, not wanting the other advisors to hear the words spoken aloud. "Pups this young, they don't understand death the way we do, Alpha, but they feel absence. They feel the shape of what's missing. Their mother carried them for months. They knew her heartbeat before they knew anything else in this world. It is possible, difficult as this may be to hear, that some part of them is searching for her and finding nothing, and that terror translates the only way they know how." Draven had said nothing to that. He had simply walked away, because there was nothing to say to a truth that cut that close to the bone. His mate, Seraphina, had died bringing those 2 lives into the world, hemorrhaging on a birthing bed while he stood outside the door, forbidden by tradition, and by healers alike from entering a delivery chamber, listening to her screams turn to silence in the space of an hour. He had never forgiven himself for staying outside that door. He suspected he never would. And now, here he was again, standing outside another door, listening to screaming he could not stop, powerless in a way that made his skin crawl with a fury that had no target, no enemy to strike down, no throat to tear open. What good was being the most feared alpha in the Northern Territories if he could not comfort his own children? "Bring me the Omega Maids," he said finally, straightening in his chair, forcing some semblance of command back into his spine. "All of them. Every single one in this castle. Line them up outside the nursery. I don't care if it's the middle of the night. Someone in this pack has to be able to reach them." Thorn hesitated. "Alpha, with respect, we tried the Omegas 2 nights ago. 4 of them went in. None of them lasted more than a few minutes before the pups' crying grew worse, not better." "Then we'll try again," Draven snarled, and this time his eyes flashed gold, the wolf rising just beneath the surface of his control. "I don't care how many times we have to try. I will not have my children screaming themselves hoarse every night while this entire castle stands around wringing its hands. Bring them. Now." Thorn bowed his head and left without another word, because arguing with an alpha whose wolf was this close to the surface was a good way to end up with claw marks across your chest, beta or not. Word spread through Blackthorn Castle the way it always did, fast and quiet. Servant to servant whispered in corridors and kitchens. The twins were crying again. The alpha was losing his mind. Every Omega in the castle was being summoned to the nursery, and none of them wanted to go. Down in the servants' quarters, in a narrow room she shared with 2 other maids, Wren was folding linens by candlelight when the summons reached her. A younger maid named Petra burst through the door, breathless, her eyes wide with the particular panic that came from being close to something the alpha wanted badly, and might punish badly if it failed. "They want everyone," Petra said. "Every Omega maid in the castle. We're supposed to go to the nursery immediately." Wren set down the linen in her hands, her fingers pausing over the fabric. She was 23 years old, small-boned even by Omega standards, with dark hair she kept braided tight against her skull, and eyes the color of rain-soaked slate. She had worked in Blackthorn Castle for 4 years, ever since her own pack had cast her out for a crime that was never entirely her fault, though no one in this castle knew that story, and she preferred to keep it that way. She scrubbed floors. She hauled water. She mended torn uniforms late into the night when her hands ached too much to hold a needle steady. She was, by any measure the pack cared to use, invisible. Unremarkable. The kind of Omega nobody looked twice at, nobody courted, nobody chose for anything more meaningful than the dirtiest, most thankless work available. "Why would they want me?" Wren asked, though she already knew the answer. It wasn't really about wanting her specifically. It was about wanting bodies, warm arms, any Omega who might trigger some instinctual calm in 2 grieving pups. She was simply one more name on a very long, very desperate list. "I don't know, and I don't think anyone's asking questions right now," Petra said. "Just come on. If we're late, Thorn will have our hides." Wren followed her up through the narrow servant stairwells that wound like veins through the castle's stone bones, up past the kitchens still smelling of last night's stew, up past the guest quarters where a few candles still burned behind closed doors, up toward the family wing where she had never once been permitted to set foot in 4 years of service. The nursery was in the east tower, a part of the castle reserved for the Alpha's bloodline, and as she climbed higher, the screaming grew louder until it filled the stairwell like something alive, something with claws, scraping at the inside of her skull. She had heard about the crying, of course. Everyone had. But hearing about it secondhand and standing outside that nursery door, feeling the sound hit her chest like a physical blow, were 2 entirely different things. Her wolf whined low and anxious beneath her skin, every instinct in her body screaming that something was deeply wrong, that young were suffering nearby, that she needed to do something even though she had no earthly idea what that something might be. A line of Omega maids, 6 of them, now including Wren and Petra, stood pressed against the corridor wall outside the nursery door, none of them making eye contact with each other, all of them looking faintly sick. Thorn stood near the door, arms crossed, his jaw tight. "You'll go in one at a time," he said, raising his voice slightly to be heard over the wailing. "Try to hold them. Try to soothe them, sing, rock them, whatever instinct tells you to do. If it doesn't work within a few minutes, come back out, and the next will go in. The Alpha is inside already. He will observe." Wren's stomach dropped at that last part. She had never been in the same room as Alpha Draven Blackthorn. She had seen him from a distance, of course, at pack gatherings, at the rare public appearances he made since his mate's death. A tall, broad-shouldered figure carved from granite and grief. A man whose reputation for ruthlessness in battle was matched only by rumors of the tenderness he'd shown his mate before her death. But standing in a room with him, being watched by him while she almost certainly failed at whatever task he'd set, felt like a special kind of terror reserved for Omegas who understood exactly how little power they held in a place like this. One by one, the maids went in. One by one, they came out minutes later, pale, some of them near tears themselves, shaking their heads at the others still waiting. The crying inside did not lessen. If anything, each failed attempt seemed to feed it, the pups sensing perhaps that yet another stranger had come and gone without solving whatever ached inside them. When it was Wren's turn, Thorn opened the door and gestured her forward without a word, his expression tired in the way of a man who had stopped believing this would work several attempts ago. The nursery was warmer than the corridor, lit by a low fire in the hearth and a scattering of candles that threw long shadows against the stone walls. 2 cribs stood side by side near the window, carved from pale wood, and in them 2 small pups writhed and screamed, their faces blotchy red, their small hands grasping at nothing. And near the window, half in shadow, stood the Alpha King himself. Wren had never seen a man look so utterly destroyed while still standing upright. Draven Blackthorn was enormous, easily a head taller than most men in the pack, with shoulders built for carrying burdens no ordinary wolf could bear. But his eyes, when they found hers across the room, held none of the fierce authority she'd expected. They were rimmed red, hollow. The eyes of a man who had not slept properly in days and had given up pretending otherwise. "Try," he said simply. His voice was rough, worn down to gravel. "Please." Wren swallowed hard and approached the cribs. Up close, the crying was almost unbearable, a physical pressure against her eardrums, and she understood now why the other maids had come out so quickly. It didn't just hurt to hear. It hurt somewhere deeper, some primal place in the chest that recognized distress in the young and screamed at you to fix it now, and offered no instructions on how. She reached into the first crib and lifted the pup closest to her. A boy, she thought, based on the blue stitching on his blanket, though it was hard to be certain amid all that thrashing and screaming. He was heavier than he looked, solid with the particular density of werewolf pups even at 8 months old, and he fought against her hold immediately, his small body rigid, his cries somehow growing even low.